given the provocations of the last presentation, invite Hal to respond or make the choice as to whether to respond immediately or let the group absorb the impact. Or who? So I'm open to volunteers. First person to make an indication.
Well, I can respond quickly. Actually, I don't want this conversation to be just about this one text, because I think there are many other things to talk about. And I knew I shouldn't have come. I also find it really difficult to defend my 27-year-old self. But just a couple of points. One, this text was written in 1983 and revised somewhat for its publication in 1985. I had very little connection to October at that point. I was not an editor. So I don't understand quite how it represents an association that I did not have at the time. And I take some of your points, Jonathan, but I think what you call occlusion, I would call situatedness. When you write as a critic, you write in a partisan way, and you write towards a subject that is right in front of you. So that text is not about historical overview, genealogy, not at all. I think it's difficult to suppress a form of practice, artistic and critical, that had not yet really emerged. And this is to your point about my occlusion, my suppression of queer art and theory. Certainly there were figures like Robert Mapplethorpe, but it had not really come to the fore and certainly wasn't conceived theoretically much at that time. Is that occlusion? Is that suppression? I don't know. And then finally, in terms of the disavowal of figures like Rauschenberg and Johns, again, I wrote towards a specific conjuncture that just didn't involve them much. But in other work that I've done, I think I've done my best to reposition the neo-avant-garde of the moment of Rauschenberg and Johns and argue very strongly for it. So I would invite some of you to look at some other texts too. But I've gone on too long.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point that Hal makes about so many of the texts that figure in our discussion, most of which, the rest of which, of course, are not our own children, even from a very long time ago, but they're all going to be partial, and the partiality has to be considered in assessing them. In fact, their incompleteness or open-endedness, of course, is what makes them, in many of the cases, as valuable as they still seem to be after some fairly long intervals in a lot of these cases. And I would also say, and I hope this doesn't sound, kind of unctuous or anything, but I think everybody on the panel is really glad that you're here, Hal. And you kind of bring with you maybe a greater weight than almost any of the rest of us, and it's bound to, exert a certain gravitational pull, which we've seen so far. With those thoughts, I'm happy to invite other responses to anything that's been said so far. Allison, I think there's a mic close to you there.
Hello? Oh, gosh, shocking. All three presentations, it seemed to me, connect on the question of the meaning of the work of art, it seems to me, and as well as Hal Foster's response to the latest turn on the question of the meaning of the work of art. And I just want to put in a little bid for when thinking about the meaning or the construction of meaning, to maybe not lose sight of the context of any communication. And I spent a lot of time thinking about not the construction of meaning through the structure of the work of art itself, or even the critic's interpretation of works of art, but about the audience context. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that part of the that part of the matrix of the communication. And in thinking about, for instance, the text about Latour and Rancière, and many of the texts actually that were chosen by the panelists today, the problem seems to be a lot with critique, and the problem with critique, and what was wrong with critique, and what happened to it. And I thought one of the things that was very much absent in all of this was not the problem of critique, but the problem is with critiques preaching to the choir. I don't know where that's going to go, but...
Paul Wood.
Is that coming through? Yeah. I'd just like to say, slightly coming off the back of not just the discussion that we've had this morning, but last night as well, that I admire the old text that's just been criticised, the subversive science text, and something that happened last night. I think we ought to. It's quite difficult to know how we negotiate this question of October's status in this postmodernist discourse, isn't it? Because I don't want the whole thing to begin to revolve around that status. And I think that there are broader questions which we want to address. And I think pulling out of the text that we've just had this morning, the thing that I'm interested in is this question of realism, which keeps sort of coming up, and the status of that postmodernist critique of representation, if you like, the idea of a kind of radical constructivism, which does indeed seem to sort of bracket certain questions of reality in favour of questions of subjective identity, that register of issues. Now, and by now I mean now, in the sort of early 21st century, what seems to be happening is that the ground changes, and that there's a kind of reopening to questions of social reality and objectivity and those kinds of things, which is certainly addressed in that the Latour paper. And the thing that jumps out to me from that is he acknowledges the sense in which radical constructivism can kind of lose the baby with the bathwater, and let in various kinds of conservative positions without much of a challenge to them. But by the same token, can't go back to a kind of naive realism, as it were, something scientistic, something focused on the notion of the fact. And he sort of makes that move where he tries to sort of invest reality with a constitutive ethical dimension. And the thing that concerns me is the way in which the question of religion sort of goes around in the background of that. It seems to be one of the ways that he can animate his sense of reality with a sort of ethical dimension. And that sits very curiously, to my mind, with some of those other registers of historical materialism that, Hal mentioned names like Lenin and Trotsky earlier on, how we relate that kind of tradition to this position that we seem to be sort of entering into now. That's the kind of nodal point that interests me at the present time in reflecting back on this period from 1975 to 95. I think that's quite stumblingly put, for which I apologise, but that's the focus that's animating me. That's why I'm here.
Bryony, did you?
No.
Ted.
Our hands got confused. It seemed to me in listening to Hal Foster's response to the Rancière that there was a little bit of a pessimism toward the idea of emancipated spectatorship, which can bring about the redistribution of the sensible, as you put it, as Rancière puts it. And it seemed to me that part of Jonathan Katz's point, was that in saying that Foster, in that essay at least, produces the means to meaning, but never meaning itself, is tied to that pessimism insofar as to find meaning, we must seek it in situated viewership. This is where meaning is born. And thinking about the role of criticism, returning to the Latour, or Rancière for that matter, is the role of the critic to produce meaning, or is it to produce the grounds upon which meaning, as a reader, as a viewer, readerly meaning, returning to Chambers, can be found?
Listening to this suggests to me a slight change of tack, but I hope continuous with what's been said so far. When we're talking, Alison brought up audiences, and knowing something about audiences, or being able to speak with confidence that we know what the choir is to which is being preached, is an empirical problem in art history, and a tough one to crack, and because of its difficulties, leads to a lot of hypothetically speculative projection of responses and experiences into the viewer, for whom the critic then, presumes to speak. And, looking at criticism, one can often, gain something by, trying to see past the ostensible arguments or statements to the style or structure in which they're expressed. And the construction of these hypothetical spectators who feel or are galvanized or changed in some way by the experience of the art, of course, is rife in criticism, but has generally lacked any confirmation in any sort of reality check or empirical test. And whether we're stuck in that mode, inevitably, pursuing it without any further development, I think is an important question that today's proceedings raise. But then my next thought from there is that, we do know something about some readers and responders who have made an impact in the conduct of art history, and whose experiences and autobiographical reflections can be brought to light. So that there are conjunctures, and the CUNY Proto-October group from the late 70s in New York is one instance that's already come up, to which Hal belongs, Mignon belongs. But there was UCLA in 1975. There was the Open University in the mid-1980s, the last two of which I just happened to bounce between in my own life. And the small groups who engaged, vividly, who engaged in a kind of existential commitment to trying to address these theoretical questions. It emerged in last night's discussion, I think, in a very satisfyingly, genuine way. And as we look back, we can't separate the abstractions from the actual people who carried them, and what each individual moment and the unlikely appearance of these nodes of people, these active little communities, I think lends some very useful concreteness to the discussions. We have representatives from the Open University here, Paul Wood preeminently. So this is a way of getting people together who were part of these things. And I'd invite, of course, reflections on other such conjunctures as well that may be prompted by this comment.
If I might, I'd like to address the question of meaning that Ted and Allison brought up, and you as well, by noting a certain degree of impoverishment when we talk about meaning as if there's a kind of univocal relationship between the viewer and the work. And I want to suggest instead that we understand, in Frank O'Hara's beautiful phrase, identity as the scene of myself, this multiplicity of identities. And works of art have, even in the same subject and same subject position, all sorts of multiple meanings. When we look at works of art, we see often contrasting things within them. And they mean very different things. And in some sense, they interrogate us or mediate us according to dominant discursive structures. And in other respects, they cause us to come to consciousness of the way we deviate from those dominant discursive structures. And as we look at those works and see that they mean to us differentially in so many different ways, what we're getting, it seems to me, is not finally meaning as some sort of given entity, but a consciousness of our active role in the constitution of signification. That's the payoff, it seems to me. And what therefore troubles me is that scene of self-construction, of recognizing that we are occasionally other to the dominant discourse that seeks to constitute us, and as right deviant to that discourse, that we are in some sense ourselves deviants, right? That scene gets lost for me in much of the writing of October, precisely because it's those critical operations not only have been taken up by the critics in question, but also, and for me much more profoundly, there is a kind of delimitation, a kind of marker on forms of meaning or discourse that are acceptable and arranged that I find, at least in these texts, ruled out of order.
But can't you say that the best way to look at that would be to look at other complexes of writing and thought that might not be quite so neatly packaged, but do exist as identifiable constellations? Each of these conjunctures I was just mentioning, generated a body of work which is distinct from the other. Not always such a convenient target, but nonetheless, in its own way, partial, self-interested, perverse, whatever, which is just the nature of these conjunctures to exhibit both the strengths and the frailties of the people involved. Which is why, say, on this side of the Atlantic, the really remarkable writings that the various Open University course teams have done, because they have to write in order to teach. Bryony, of course, was part of that as well. Has not had the salience that it should for, I don't know, peculiar non-cognitive reasons.
But Tom, it is precisely the fact that it hasn't had the salience that raises for me the key problematic. And that is that why is it the case that I think you're absolutely right, that there are all these other voices at this time, and they should have been heard, but that they weren't.
Yeah, but whose fault is that? I mean, they just didn't. I mean, people didn't reach out to things that were readily available.
No, see, and that's where you and I...
Or bring them to the fore, which is, I think, now the function of an occasion like this to make up for that lack. But I think that there's plenty of negative responsibility to be spread around in this case.
And see, and I guess I would disagree and say that I see that this particular mode achieving dominance over the other modes that you rightfully point out coexisting is itself a rich ideological formation that we could get into and seek to understand.
We should certainly try to do that. But Katie had a comment. I saw your hand. Didn't you?
I'll just say that this will come up with Bourdieu later.
Okay.
That's partly what you need is some
Sorry,
ethnographer or someone to come in and parse why these things happened and what were the ways through which certain things were adopted and certain things weren't, and that's a sociological question, I think, not a hermeneutic one.
Yeah, we were, in fact, Katie and a group of us were talking last night about a kind of breakdown in the ethics of citation, where citation becomes, in a way, a statement, a polemical statement, rather than, a more impersonally felt responsibility to the existing literature on a question. And when you don't have a wide and even, ethic of citation, that's another thing that contributes to other constellations being lost sight of.
It's a self-feeding mechanism where students go to look at the articles and essays that have been published, and they see certain things are footnoted, and that just propagates itself historically. But I'd say the interesting thing, maybe more in terms of the content of these essays, is it's instructive to see how, and it's such an obvious point, even an ethic or an ideology of doubt can become an authoritarian position. But that's not a reason to throw out the critical mode, or maybe it's better not to call it critique, but one of doubt, which doesn't separate it from what Jonathan is talking about, something that is not fixed and not certain, but is a mode of testing, perhaps is maybe the way more of an artist would think of it, a mode of testing reality, rather than critiquing it from an authoritative position. And then there's no reason that it ceases to function as an interesting way to operate, and certainly one superior, I would say, in a lot of times to belief, which has its threatening social implications, of bringing back with it, being synchronized with religion. So criticality can be an authoritative position for an academic leftist, or it can be authoritative position for, some jackass who doesn't believe in, global warming. So the important thing is not the mode of operating is corrupt. It's the mode of operating in conjunction with an authoritarian position that's corrupt.
I'm coming sort of out of order here, but I wanted to say a little bit to Jonathan's remarks, because I've been thinking since you made them about how they bear upon my own practice, my own thinking about Hal Foster's work in particular. And one simple point that I still feel is worth making is about the activity of working as a critic. I think it would be disinhibiting for any of us who write as critics to imagine that in doing that and developing, let's say, a critical discourse, trying to frame terms, to think that the specific artists that we nominated in those texts would be taken as the list, in some sense, that rather than enabling the development of questions, that we would be simply stating, what the answers to those questions are in the form of artist names. So to be a little bit more concrete about this in terms of what, let's say, Hal's work has offered to me, and I have been affiliated with October, but I have also been very interested in writing about some artists who might be, let's say, phobic objects for some of the editors of that journal. But that in no way diminishes the significance of their work for my understanding of those artists. Those are not the same. So the possibility of taking up a set of criminal, my next contribution is going to be on the subject of the unconscious. So I bring it to you. But I suppose I feel that it's important to think about what, let's say in the case of articulating a politics of subjectivity, to return to what you're specifically interested in and the omissions that trouble you, what the whole discourse around that makes possible for you and for me that otherwise we would have to invent. I think for me it's problematic to turn one's back on that simply because maybe we see, and I have some sympathy for this part of what you're saying, particular moments or politics that haven't been addressed. But just to return to the point, for me, writing now, I would simply be silenced if I thought that by making a critical contribution, I was somehow saying that those people, those important artists who are not part of this contribution are therefore not in my terms significant. Do you know what I mean there?
I do know what you mean, but I just want to ask, in the case of somebody like McCullum, for example, this is an artist who frames black picture frames and hangs them. Used to, at the time in question. And that work seems to, doesn't it, just demand at least reference to Rauschenberg's black paintings and white paintings in terms of its, I mean, maybe you see it differently, and I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, but that also could be seen as a kind of standard classroom, genealogy or influence. That is, it can certainly cut two ways. That is, the familiarity of the reference to the Rauschenberg can kind of vitiate what one would take away from the McCullum. But I think, Rob,
I just wanted to at least have an opportunity to bring my suggested reading in a little bit, because when you were speaking, Jonathan, about proposing this idea of a multiple, the way that the work engenders multiple subjectivities, and your critique of the kind of post-structuralist reading, which is not interested in the representational quotient of the work, but rather its structure, how meaning is produced, that I believe is what Michaels is arguing is a false dichotomy, right? That in fact, if the work means everything and it means nothing, we're in the same problem. What would it mean to say, yes, in fact, this work actually means something. It means one thing in some ways. Now, to speak about, perhaps the kind of oblivion of certain modes like the Open University, I mean, I think there's something about the generative possibilities of the open text, whether it's in terms of multiple interpretations or the structural analysis, that invites it invites a certain kind of receptivity, because it promises a kind of future potential, that that the work is not exhausted. And I think one of the great critiques of postmodern or post-structural theory, critical theory, is that to impose a meaning is to kill the work, right? That once you say that means that, or that Rauschenberg is about a certain moment in the 50s, the work no longer is speaking to us. It really is. It should be an ethnographic museum or something like that. It doesn't have the kind of philosophical quotient that I think many of us believe art has. And so I guess, my choice of Michaels is both as a good object and a bad object in some ways. But I think if you temper it a little bit with the kind of realist approach of someone like Latour, to suggest that, yes, we can say, what would it mean to say, in fact, the work of Mapplethorpe is about this, or this work by Mapplethorpe, or this work by Levine is, in fact, about this, recognizing that this is provisional and, of course, a fiction, and yet that these provisional fictions have real social agency, that in fact, I always imagine that this sort of work, its agency is allegorical in some ways, whereas I think the critical theory model posits its agency in a much more non-fictional way. And, so in some ways, I guess, I see as a good deconstructivist a kind of parallelism between the critical theory and the works of fiction that we address, and they both have agency, but it's only, in some ways, through a kind of imaginary relationship with the real world.
Can I just respond to that? Because I just want to say that I think there's a huge difference between saying that works can mean many things and saying works can mean everything. And what I'm trying to suggest, in fact, is that we need a careful taxonomy of all the different ways works can mean. And but I want to say that I think that a given work can mean one thing to an artist, another thing to the artist's partner, another thing to those of us who have no relationship to their right, and also call attention to various parts of ourselves that we perhaps don't want to articulate or even recognize in public context. And all of that needs to be brought out, and that is all part of the process of meaning making, but that is not saying that it can mean everything.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was me, was it you? Yeah, I mean, far be it from me to far be it from me to is this one on? Yeah. Far be it from me to pardon? Far be it from me to rescue the Open University from the oblivion which it. Quite a lot of what we've done is probably best consigned to oblivion, but I think one of the things which it's a slightly false dichotomy in a way, and the risk of sounding like the very kind of liberal that I normally want to be critical of. Ours has been an educational project, and we've in the various courses which we've sort of produced over several decades now, what we tend to do is try and represent many different voices, including voices of October and its cognates, and very, very different ones indeed. You know, sort of feminist voices and so on and so forth. So that we try and present this kind of material so that the student, who I think is the sort of be-all and end-all of the project, can begin to make their own minds up and have their own readings and these kinds of different interpretations, and to work it out for themselves. So I think it's quite important to have this sense of a kind of dialogical, conversational, dialectical set of interplays, rather than a kind of authority, I suppose. I mean, authority is something that we try and work our way round. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the kind of work that we've done, but it is very pluralistic.
Can I just add to that, Paul, because it's quite strange looking at your life. I'm seeing myself in a primal therapy session here where my origins are increasingly opaque to me, and not recognizing oneself in the characterizations of these moments that seem so very important. And I mean, there are many ways in which I find myself responding, but I guess one very simple way is that, aside from the fact that I guess I was naive enough to think that people were listening to what we were saying at the Open University, but also that it never was monolithic, and it was itself a contested field that was what made it so important. And that's my powerful memory of that time in the early 80s, with you as well as many other people, Tom, but also that sense of, you know, it's very formative for me, the fact that the most important lesson you learned was that this was not monolithic, but something to be fought over and for. And I always thought that of October as well. So I feel myself as a kind of mongrel here, because I was very much formed within a certain kind of fierce and in many ways brutal kind of set of debates in Britain in the early 80s, but also felt myself, you know, really responded to much of the work that came out of October in all its differences. And in some ways, I think that attack on the monolithic was one of the most important aspects of that moment. And I think one of the problems that besets us with the kind of trying to historicize this is, of course, what happens inevitably is the institutionalization of a lot of these theoretical debates. In some ways, very good, but obviously, in other ways, very disconcerting for those in many other ways. And I think that one of the ways in which that creates a kind of homogeneity, or, the way that we identify the October position or this position or that, I've found increasingly anathema and kind of unhelpful to my way, anyway, of trying to think, or to think about thinking as well. And without wanting just to be a happy pluralist where we go around with our kind of shopping trolley and we pick this or we pick that, it seems to me that it's important to get back to what those fundamental questions are and how they've changed. And in one sense, the institutionalization of a lot of those ideas have led to, I think, our concentrating here on a kind of very much an Anglo-American kind of critical tradition, and that no longer holds the dominant position. And I think it's very important in the conversations that we're going to have that what's happened to art history is geography in a very kind of radical and dramatic way, that in some ways those early polarizations really don't even begin to kind of equip us to think about the present field that is highly dispersed, very disparate, and certainly not kind of simply hinging on this Anglo-American axis.
Yeah, well, that, of course, opens up a wide field, and I think some legitimate questions as to whether our, jettisoning the local in our own formation or our own perhaps blinkered present preoccupations or matters of concern is an open and shut case. I think, caring for the things or exercising some stewardship about the things that you actually know about that are part of your own life and formation might be seen as your chief responsibility, which could be undermined or diluted by a kind of moral imperative to embrace the wider world in which your competence rapidly decreases, and whether you're then making any kind of significant contribution to make up for what you've given up or been forced away from by an ethic of inclusiveness is necessarily a positive thing. And that's why this revisiting of the past, however, for the young people in the audience, how ancient it may all seem, but then the question is to ask, well, say, since these formations occurred in Los Angeles, in New York, in London, and bearing all the marks of the special character of those particular places and the way that they came to be in an interesting kind of dialogue or tension with one another, what are the next three? What are the subsequent ones that have taken place that would be commensurable? Or have they occurred? And if they haven't occurred or occurred only weakly, why is that the case? What we all had going for us at these particular moments was relative marginality and the fact that the stakes were only the ones we created, because it didn't look like anybody was going to be terribly interested in it in terms of the wider institutional world, and then it turned out they were, which has led us to this, to this conversation today. But Ted had a comment.
This just goes back to some of the conversation we were having maybe 3 or 4 moments ago, but about the question of how we propose the meaning of the work of art as critics, right? My question is just, is there a way to propose what your meaning for a work of art is as a social historical subject without making that meaning authoritative? Is there a way you can propose what this work means to you or people you know that does not foreclose how it could mean to other people? Or is there a way to do that in such a way that prompts other responses that may indeed conflict with your own?
I think that one of the...
Doesn't seem just minor or confessional.
Yes.
I mean, one way is to acknowledge other positions, and not in a way that caricatures them, but takes them equally seriously as to the way one takes one's own. And I think that this, one of the things, what Brian and Tom are talking about, is recognizing the locality of one's own position, and that the beginning of historicizing this period, which we're looking at least with our students, a lot of us are as students, you know, especially Ted, sure. that is to look at how much what we're talking about in the most general way that's become like an artistic style becomes etiolated after an artist has repeated it and 80 people have copied it, is that it's something that was actually very much local, very much about conditions in New York during those years, and to restore some of that history with all of the various positions, and equally in London or the other places that were contributing to this conversation, that it's a historical moment, just like Paris was in 1913. Before going on, I think, or alongside going on, part of that activity will to say what was happening in Los Angeles, what was happening in these various places that contributed to this discourse. And I think that taking seriously of those range of positions is part of taking responsibility for that.
And I would add to that another way you can do that is from the institutional side. Since so much of us are going through academic institutions, and you know all of that is to allow other the broadening of perspectives, and not make critique or discourse overly cliquish and self-referential.
Can I just respond to Tom a little bit? Because in many ways I'm completely with you on that sense of, you know, the point is not to throw out the local. And what the local means in this instance is to, in some ways, put ourselves collectively in question. And what it was, the specificities of those moments and those places, and the complexity of that. I think that is very important. But I think the arguments about specificity can also, or need to be, counterbalanced by some level of abstraction, clearly. And I think that in some ways the onus is also on us to take on board, now I'm going to be a little linear, but if we think about the two pivotal dates, and if Rancière does anything, I think he does give us these two dates rather than simply 1968 and its aftermath. He brackets it with 1989 and the absolute kind of fundamental, pivotal role that 1989 has in the breaking up of Europe and the different transformations that we need to take account of. And I think that even if we might not have been there, that the kind of political and artistic and ethical resonances of all of that, you know, that has to be factored in, I think, to our overview of this period, rather than simply the kind of, you know, what it felt like from the inside, which clearly, you know, is also, I mean, I completely take your point about the intricacies of these interconnections, which I think is very revealing to us.
I also just feel that at risk of perhaps isolating myself from this, I think, laudable goal, I'm worried about a kind of weak pluralism within it that makes us blind to some of the operative social and cultural conditions that led to one kind of discourse being valued over another. And I don't think it's a sociological question. I think it's an ideological question. And I can't help but notice that at the time that these discourses are beginning to gather steam, and we are, at least in my classrooms, talking about the death of the author, authors are dying left and right all around me, and that never enters the pages. And there is, it seems to me, a broader social historical moment under which this critical ascendancy happened, and that critical moment we ought to submit to criticism as well.
Matthew.
The issue for me, though, would be just to take up the, I mean, this is a mechanical criticism on my part, and I don't want to pursue it, but it's just the geographic specificity of all of this is rather extreme. And essentially everything that Tom was talking about the locality of things is a sort of radical situatedness is more or less what I suppose I would favor if we're in trying to create a sort of historical panorama that would attempt to describe this time period. I noticed that the title doesn't have a geographic limit, but it does. It has a temporal limit. So it strikes me that space is probably the missing term, and trying to come up with some sort of thick description of spatial interconnections would be a place to go. And Jonathan, I take it that it strikes me that this is a very, I find your criticisms to be compelling, absolutely. My question immediately is well, how many situations akin to the situation that you were describing were taking place between 1975 and 1995? And are there homologies between these different situations? If so, why? Why not? Those sorts of things. I'll have more to say about that later, I guess.
Jim, have you got any thoughts that we could drag out of you?
Yep, sure. This is very interesting in relation to Matthew's comment, which I'm not supposed to follow up on, about geographies, because there would be much more to be said about that, not only in relation to what you said at the end, but some of the things we were talking about yesterday, geographies in other places and practices that might be considered as relevant interpretive practices that might, under some circumstances, be recognizable as art histories or critical histories. And it's just difficult to know exactly when such interventions might be useful. But at any rate, the awareness of that might be one thing. Actually, what I was going to say was in a different register, which is why I wasn't jumping in. I'm interested in the uses that we are so far making of our texts. And we have developed, I guess this came up yesterday, this notion that we have good and bad objects, and so Hal disavows one of his. And, but there's another way of looking at this, and that is that some of our texts are of historiographic interest, and others are of methodological or theoretical interest. And that seems to me maybe, so far at least, already an interesting problematic. And in relation to Rancière and that weird pairing of Rancière and Latour, which I know wasn't your own, the Rancière, that chapter that we were given to read ends in what I think of as a fairly typical manner, and that is that he has all of a sudden, the ambulance rushes in at the end, and he says something like, to escape the circle is to start from different presuppositions, assumptions that are certainly unreasonable from the perspective of our oligarchic societies, blah, blah. Thus, it would be assumed that the incapable are capable, that there's no hidden secret in the machine, and so on. I think there's a parallel between that and what you call, I think, the panacea of the redistribution of the sensible, in that it's very persuasive. Rancière is often very persuasive to me, but also often useless. The problem is that kind of counterintuitive formulation is that's the thing that people, that's the pill they swallow or that they want. And there's a parallel, I think, a pretty close parallel structurally, not in terms of content, with the Latour, because Latour also, at the end of that essay, brings in the inadequacy of objects as inadequately convened things, which connects to his entire deeper philosophy of the rethinking objectification. And so people who use that also are faced with this moment of the difficult moment of the pragmatic. So this is just all by way of suggesting that it might be possible to read those two texts and maybe others not as theory objects, good or bad, but as historiography. In other words, it is a fact in the art world that artists are nourished by these things in ways that maybe as scholars we might think of as insupportable, but that is a fact of the artistic field. So some of our theory might be historiography, and some of our historiography might be theory.
Can I just have a postscript to the Rancière, which I thought was interesting because it represents a moment of collusion between contemporary art and philosophy, as if the kind of frictions that have been kind of traveling through our period come together in Rancière, who is a sort of philosopher of choice for many artists, but who deploys so centrally as his site of exemplification instances, often rather simplistically, but instances of contemporary art. And that actually seems to me symptomatic of something that's happened. He also has himself a very interesting historiography because, of course, Rancière himself is rather old, but has only come to prominence, I think, really after our period, even though he was working and living through it. And one of the people, there are several, but one of the people most responsible for promoting Rancière in an English-speaking world is the British critic and theorist Adrian Rifkin, who tried to get History Workshop Journal to publish Rancière texts way back, at least in the early 80s, and they wouldn't publish it. So there's this sense of a kind of delay, and I think there's also in our notion of historiography these kind of weird, after effects and delays, and the temporality of it is very complex. Now, a historian would approach that in one way. We might think about it in all sorts of ways, but he's an odd kind of symptom in some ways, it seems to me, that is not quite like the kind of normal examples we might bring to bear.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of things I could say, but one thing I want to reclaim, which I don't think we've pulled out enough, is the insistence in the presentation by Rob about the status of realism and representation. And this was seconded by Paul in an early remark in the conversation. And I think that one stake here, or one story, is that somehow critical theory, and I urge all of us not to totalize, as I just did there, not to totalize, not to fetishize October, too. But there's a certain story here, which is that critical theory somehow put in doubt the possibility of realism, the possibility of a representational relation to reality. And that this is forwarded by Michaels, even though you're ambivalent about Michaels, certainly by Latour too, that this kind of withdrawal from the real by default led us to a celebration of identity and to the vicissitudes of identity wars, and that we've somehow fallen from the objective to the subjective. And I wonder if we just can't push back a little bit on this implicit narrative here. I agree with you, Tom, that there is a way in which the viewer came in after form, after style, is the great art historical topic. The Dutch viewer, the enlightened viewer, the 19th century viewer, sometimes called the observer, sometimes called the spectator. But there is a way in which there was a shift from the objective, broadly construed, to the subjective in the discipline, even among social historians of art, too. And I, too, have reservations about this shift. But I think that the story that we want to somehow believe, that critical theory undid the real and defaulted us to the particularisms of identity, and it's subjectivity is somehow opposed to reality. I mean, don't some of you want to question that account? I hope. Jonathan, you nod furiously, but in fact, that was part of your account.
No, actually, I don't think so.
Oh, here, take a club and have that.
No, I don't think so at all, actually, because one of the things that actually is so striking about, let's just, forgive me, I'm bad at abstractions. I'd like to keep this sort of centered on an object. So let's, for sake of conversation, choose the John's flag again. And one of the striking things about that flag is that so many different things are happening, not least of which are the burying in the stripes of that flag of newspaper fragments, of aspects, some of which broadly connote a politics, others that do not. And what Johns is trying to do is to offer us, it seems to me, a scene of imbrication where identity and the real meet. And that doesn't mean, and this is what I'm trying to push, why I'm nodding furiously, is that I think we need to understand the degree to which it's not an either-or choice. It's never an either-or choice. And that we make it an either-or choice is itself an ideology we need to understand.
Or could we also say it's no choice at all? I mean, the formula about art and life, and art being, migrating to life, the barrier being broken down, et cetera, in descriptions, say, of the historical avant-garde having, attempted or partially achieved this, has always struck me as a really strange formulation. It might make sense for an artist like Rauschenberg to say he wants to operate in the gap between art and life, one little quip that has had a gigantic afterlife. And that's an everyday folksy way of thinking about how art as a specialized pursuit relates to the rest of the world. But there is no outside to life. Art is life. There's no actual distinction to be drawn except in ways that are unhelpful and falsifying. And if we just dropped that vocabulary completely, I think a lot of things might come clearer. It's a simple admonition. And I was thinking along these lines when I was reading the Walter Ben Michaels text. He's an English professor, I think, and I was actually pleased with some of his literary references. For example, to the great prose stylist Neil Stevenson, who doesn't really get all that much respect in academic circles. But on the other hand, the way his argument proceeds is, it seems to me, to take, a clustered group of people who've written around a certain subject, generate a kind of weighted average of what they had to say, and then move on to the next cluster. And for all of his, admonitions that we enter into, a more realist frame of mind, there are no reality checks along the way. There are no actual observations of the things to which his fellow commentators are responding.
I actually don't situate Michaels as a realist, except in the kind of modernist Freudian understanding of realism, which is the most real thing is the work's materiality in some ways. So he's a very strange derivation of realism. I mean, just to kind of maybe, first of all, I'll say I chose Michaels not because of, I find the syllogism of his arguments problematic too. I'm not here to defend it. And like many texts, we're very good at deconstructing text, right? But I think there's value that we can take from this text. Just going back to Hal's point, that I think, again, recognizing in the syllogism of Michael's thought, it's not just the crisis of the sign leads to the emergence of identity politics, but it also leads to this kind of post-structural I don't want to say fetishization, but interest in structure over reference, right? That becomes the site of focus. And again, I guess my quip would be that perhaps we have misrecognized, we have misrecognized realism focusing on the content of realism rather than the stakes of realism, right? That we've kind of focused on the fact that the content of realism is always a myth, always a code, whereas the stakes of realism are that reality matters. And in some ways, in that sense, we are all, I would like to believe, as intellectuals, as art history not as a craft but as an intellectual pursuit, I suspect we're all realists to a certain degree.
Can I add a bit to that, and by way of, can I ask you, Hal, to elaborate a little bit on this idea of the necessity of pushing back and its possible correlation with interest in identity politics, things like that. I'd be interested in hearing more about the historical and critical situation that enables us to frame that issue. This goes to my own interest of the difference between theory and historiography, because we have a time period that we're ostensibly concentrating on here, and yet we have an awareness of a problem, which I think that, you articulated and summarized that quite well. We have, there's an awareness now of this issue that we would wish to push back on certain consequences of the received idea of what our critical apparatus has enabled us to do. That awareness of that as a problem is itself historically bounded. It doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of our period, for example, where other descriptions, other self-descriptions would be in play. So I'm wondering about the times and places in which that problem could appear and could possibly be something which could be applied with some historical purchase to the period that we're considering.
Could you ask the question again, really simply?
I just mean to say, yeah, right. I just mean to say that this does appear on a critical horizon. This problem.
What does appear?
The problem that the self-description of critical theory as an unmasking, which then possibly also leads to an emphasis on identity and other issues, is itself something that needs to be pushed back against, I think is the metaphor you used. The problem appears in several ways, obliquely in several texts, and then explicitly in your intervention a minute ago. But I'd like to get a better sense of the historical framing of that as a problem. When did that first appear as a problem? And if it is, in fact, a fairly recent notion that would be considered a problem, then how would it be best thought of as applicable to the historical conditions that we're considering?
You mean the problem of critique? When does that become, when do the conditions arise that we can be critical of critique?
In that way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm not sure this will be the short version, but the short version for me is that critique is part of the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment projects a model of the enlightened subject versus the unenlightened subject. The unenlightened subject is associated with the fetishist for historical reasons of colonial subjugation, that the fetishist is the other of the enlightened because he or she is bound up with desire for an object that he or she does not fully understand, projects life, power, authority to this object. And that one essential function of critique is to undo this fetishization, which I think has happened, again, just as an aside, abundantly vis-a-vis October today. So I think that's really basic to critique for me, throughout the modern period. It's what Marx attempts to do in relation to the commodity. It's what Freud, with a little bit less ambition because he feels that we can escape fetishism. It's what he attempts to do in relation to our sexual objects. And I think that continues in different forms of critique. It always assumes that there's a critical position outside that realm of desire, misrecognition, and so on. So it assumes a distance, an authority of the critic that should be and can be and has been challenged. But this is where I wanted to push back on the kind of refusal of demystification in Latour and Rancière, because for me there is no critique without, some version of demystification, deconstruction. I mean, whatever you want to call it. I know it's very important to distinguish between these methods, but there is a certain anti-fetishization that is absolutely fundamental to critique for me, and its variety is modern and postmodern. And that's why I wanted to push back on that different relation to the object. I mean, Paul mentioned that there's a kind of invocation of religion in some of these texts. And they're, this is reductive, but it's not irrelevant that Latour is, practices as a Catholic. He wants us to have a different relationship to the object world than I do as a, pathetic Protestant iconoclast.
Can I just, because I think we don't want to reify the distinction architecturally between panel and audience, open it up for query. And are there microphones in the audience? No. Thank you.
While the microphones are taking their places at the aisle, and we do invite you now to ask questions, I just wanted to say, just very succinctly, seconding what Hal just said, but maybe just making it a little more simple, which is that the process of thought begins by refusing the ostensible. And, what these theories that came our way, when we were younger, the 1970s, offered was a support and a set of structures for doing that. And the trap to fall into is to succumb once again to fetishism, even of a metaphysical kind, like religion, but it's also just to succumb to given, received, ostensible meanings, congealed into images, which we certainly want to keep refusing, even if it doesn't have quite the excitement that process had, 30 years ago.
Tom, do you want to moderate the question? Would you raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to say? Anybody?
Yes, here on the right.
I'm an artist, so I don't exactly speak your language, but I'm wondering, when you speak about defetishizing a work, do you also find at times that the fetishization of a work is actually intrinsic to the work and the meaning of the work? Have I stumped you?
That's a very good question, I think. Yes, because the works of art that ride our propensity to fetishism as part of what can be genuine meaning. Alison?
Exactly. I am not anti-spectacle or anti-fetish. But I think you can't be a good anti-fetishist without indulging the fetish temporarily, because you can't know it otherwise. There's something to experience and knowing and sensual knowing, and that I think we have to embrace that which you, at some point. I mean, you can't just ward off fetishes all the time and then speak about fetishes. So I think that there's actually something, every time I think about criticality, I think about, where does the impulse to critical thought really come from? Does it come from the structure of the work of art, and to some extent, perhaps, but so much more often, it seems, when you look at people's responses to art, it's an inclination that arrived there before the work was there to even think about it. I mean, if you look at something like Olafur Eliasson's, some gathering, the big sun, the weather project and all of that, and you think of that as some sort of fetish or spectacle, or Shai Guo-Cheng's explosion event or something like this as sort of a grand spectacle. I think about how much people actually convene around spectacles and then actually think about them afterwards. Does spectacle, in its own way, invite thought? And can you make somebody think critically about anything? These are questions I have.
Another question from the floor. There, on the left-hand side.
Hi, thanks. I have to confess I was really terrified last night when I arrived in Williamstown and discovered I hadn't done the homework. A beautiful and astonishing, array of texts that you all have presented, and a really amazingly rich sort of start of a conversation about a 2-decade period that is. We all still tremble, in the wake of the earthquakes of this period of time. That the rise of Thatcher, the triumph and enduring legacy of Reagan, among many other things. The questions that I really have to ask all of you are the names that I wanted to see or were wondering, that were important to me at the time, particularly people who might fall between Professors Foster and Katz, people like Craig Owens, or people like Bill Olander. These were men who worked outside of the academia that we're also comfortable with, but who were, particularly Craig at Art in America, and Bill at places like the New Museum and elsewhere, really, really critical voices who, of course, are now vanished because of the other sort of earthquake or tidal wave, or how do we describe it, of the arrival of AIDS. So is there a way in which we can use these voices and these other people who some are still with us, Ron Clark, who still labors away at the Whitney program doing all sorts of things, to sort of enrich and open out into some of what seems to be unnecessary loggerheads that perhaps are emerging?
Yeah, another very apposite comment. Can it stand as a comment, or does people have some further reflections on that?
I just wanted to say I think it's absolutely apt, very, very sharp comment, and I just wanted to say that for somebody like me, both figures were, of course, central. Bill was a friend, and conversations with Bill sharpened me considerably, and I drank Craig's essays in, especially Gay Men and Feminism and other works, because I was so parched.
Yeah, Bill Olander gave me my first good review of Painters of Public Life in the New York Times, so I have forever, at a time when I really needed it, and so I'm forever grateful to his memory.
Can I respond as well? Yeah, I was just going to say, I too think that, at least for me, Owens is central to this history. His transition from within October to outside of October, the allegorical nature of his work within October. I had a paper that I did earlier, which was about Craig Owens, and it was called the Coming Out in and of Postmodernism, Craig Owens' allegorical impulse. And I find that in writing about the allegorical impulse, he is in fact being allegorical in this way. He is participating, in his words, referring to Levine and Sherman, of course, but participating in the thing in order to critique it. And that is the central operation of postmodernism for me. Even if it is not clear in that moment in which he was doing it, it certainly became clear, at least to me, looking back, reading, the discourse of others, the Medusa effect, outlaws, gay men and feminism. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one last question before we break. No break, sorry. Sorry to have raised your hopes. This is a marathon.
Yeah, sorry, I'll keep it as an observation, but rather than we would need too many responses. But I'm just trying to imagine what this would be like if there were 15 art historians who specialize in 17th and 18th century art sitting out there, attempting to talk about critical theory. It seems to me it's perfectly possible, abstractly, but it doesn't seem very realistic.
Oh, I would, if I understand you right, I would disagree. I mean, it certainly doesn't accord with my own excavation of my earlier life, where, you know, I got to studying 18th century France by the root of the discovery of critical theory. In fact, I would never have done it otherwise. I had this ambition, if you'll indulge me, to write, you know, a completely unknown type of dissertation that would be on the model of Roland Barthes' SZ, the detailed anatomization of the codes involved in one very compact work of art. And I thought that I would do it around the death of Marat. And I still think that actually would be quite a good project. But my advisor at the time, Tim Clark, said, well, that sounds really pretty interesting, but do you know anything about 18th century French art? So then I had to go away and find out something about it, and that turned out to be my vocation rather than the thing that I had first intended to do, and then he did it. Which I don't begrudge him at all, because I preferred the path that I ended up taking. So that at least is a self-indulgent answer to your question.
I think one major difference is for the period that we're talking about, there's a certain parallel or an alignment between the analyzing discourse and the discourse under analysis. That in many ways, the work that we're talking about was historically commensurate with the theory that is emerging. So that it makes the subject, I think, particularly tricky because of the implication. I mean, there's nothing wrong, and I think we all applaud, you know, historians of 18th or classicists using critical theory, but it's precisely, I think, the fact that these modes were contemporaneous with the art under analysis that makes this issue crucial.
We have one more.
I have a very short question. Thank you for your presentations. And it comes back to some comments that Brownie Fair made earlier. And I'm wondering, what would be the impact of, it comes back to this issue of locality in New York and just this time period and the kind of conditions within which critics were sort of operating, as well as the bigger context out there. So what kind of impact would something like Edward Said's Orientalism have had? How did that reverberate through this sort of moment?
Can I take a stab at that by actually changing the terms a little bit, much less ambitiously, towards just what it meant even in California, where I was then in school, to be witnessing what was coming out of New York, and finding that what I understood to be the seismic forces structuring my world were very different, it seemed, than the forces at work in New York City, and a strong sense of dislocation and non-participation. And I think that's probably the case from a lot of different perspectives.
Let me just add very quickly. I came to New York right out of college, drawn to the art underway then, and the theory too. But I came specifically to study with Edward Said, just at the moment when in seminar, he was at work on Orientalism. So it was absolutely crucial for me. And that was obviously the birth of post-colonial discourse, which is where critical theory in many ways went. But at Columbia, Said was the one who taught Foucault, Derrida, Adorno. I mean, he did the Frankfurt School as well, and he worked his way back to Gramsci and Vico. So at that moment, he was an extraordinary matrix of all kinds of different critical theories, even as he, as Tom suggested in his own work, processed those critical theories towards his own project in Orientalism.